Afua Hirsch is a journalism professor at the University of Southern California. She's British, of mixed, white, Jewish and African heritage. Afua, welcome back to our programme.
Thank you.
I said all that because I think you're perfectly positioned, not only as a professor on one of these campuses, but your whole heritage gives you so much experience, lived experience, as to what's going on. What was the last message you had as you were leaving campus to come here to London at the end of semester?
Yeah, so I taught my final class of a semester in which I am teaching my students to hold people in power accountable, to ask difficult questions and to stand up for the truth. That's the ethos of teaching, especially teaching journalism. And as I taught my last class of the semester and as my plane was taking off for London, I was receiving messages from students who were witnessing riot police entering campus after peaceful protests, and some of them being arrested and taken into police custody. So that was really my last experience as I left the end of this semester, and things have only escalated since then.
Now, at USC, the valedictorian, her name is Asna Tabassum, who is a Muslim, she said, "I was hoping to use my commencement speech to inspire my classmates with a message of hope. By cancelling my speech, USC is only caving to fear and rewarding hatred." What have do you agree, by the way, and do you think the administrators could have de-escalated, just like on Brown, for instance, even at Northwestern?
I'm glad you mentioned Brown and Northwestern, because it's a reminder that these students actually have reasonable demands. This isn't just an excuse for some kind of spontaneous anarchy. It's hard to imagine how an undergraduate student who's made valedictorian presents such a great security challenge that it defeats the university administration. And many of us, and I include myself, feel that that was used as an excuse to justify a totally illegitimate attempt to try and pacify critics by removing her free speech.
Presumably, I mean, America has a written constitution, unlike ours here in Britain, that guarantees free speech. The universities seem to be completely, floundering, trying to figure out where to draw the line.
I do question how much the university administration understands the concept of free speech and how much it understands the history of protest. The point of free speech is that people have the right to say things that you might find uncomfortable or inconvenient. There would be no need for a right of free speech if it was only protecting things we wanted to hear. And the accusation that protest is disruptive seems to misunderstand the point of protest. The leverage that students have in a world where they don't have much power is that they are able to disrupt. And if you look at the history of protest, its aim has been to disrupt with the intention of forcing people to hear demands and think about wider injustices. And that's exactly what these protests are doing. Now, there is obviously a responsibility for those in authority to protect safety. There has been a real lack of evidence that there was a threat to safety and security from the protests that happened. And, when I speak to my Muslim students, they tell me that they feel that this is really about whose safety matters more, because the idea that some students feel uncomfortable as a result of the protests and that justifies arresting and using violence against those who are protesting really suggests that this is about a hierarchy of power, whose needs are more important and who's seen. And, when you look at the history of protests, if you look at the civil rights movement in America, for example, take the Montgomery bus boycott, it wasn't always the initial demands of protesters that rallied wider public support. It was the disproportionate policing and the use of brutality to crush those protests that actually end up having the opposite effect to the one intended and really mobilise.
But I want to ask you this. As we talked about, each side has to be careful not to delegitimize their cause. So here's a Gazan-born Palestinian analyst, Ahmad Fuad al-Khatib, who said, "Please adopt pragmatism as a necessary approach or ethos for actually getting things done, instead of wasting time with slogan-driven and maximalist activism that does nothing. Use your Western privilege to actually help the Palestinian people and promote a pragmatic path forward by engaging Israeli and Jewish audiences."
We don't look very much at protest and grassroots movements. And as a result, there's a tendency to depict them as these anarchic, disorganised, vague movements of these idealistic young people who don't really know what they're doing. I really would challenge that in this occasion. There is a very specific list of demands these students have, and they are themselves historically literate and aware of previous experiences. For example, the 1980s. In 2 years, 100 universities in America divested from companies that were linked to the South African apartheid regime. That had a significant impact on the viability of apartheid. These students are calling for disinvestment from Israel and companies linked to the Israeli military for a reason that they believe in the potential of that demand to actually make a difference to the outcome.
And final question, because this is getting a lot of take on campus and those who are listening. Benjamin Netanyahu is a master of seizing the political moment, right?
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s.
I really resent the comparison. My grandfather lived through Germany in the 1930s as a young Jew, and he and many of his contemporaries became lifelong advocates of progressive politics. They were against ethno-nationalism, and they were against the use of violence because of what they experienced. Those beliefs mirror exactly what these students are calling for. I mean, I would say to someone like Netanyahu, what does a protest against Israel's war in Gaza that isn't anti-Semitic look like? Because he is so quick to weaponize anti-Semitism, to shut down legitimate scrutiny and accountability for Israel's actions. I am not dismissive of anti-Semitism. We all need to be unequivocal in condemning anti-Semitism. We also need to be unequivocal in seeing and condemning Islamophobia where we see it. I don't draw a difference or a distinction between forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination against minoritized groups. My sense from the time I've spent in America, as well as my life in the UK, is that there is a great awareness for the problem of anti-Semitism and a willingness to take it seriously, which I applaud. Meanwhile, legitimate calls for a change in policy in the Middle East and the lived experiences of Muslim students does not attract the same level of sympathy or awareness.